you. Thank you all and welcome everyone. Before I introduce Joseph, I want to mention just briefly who our speaker is for November, and that's Janice Schwab, who's a member of our chapter. Janice took a trip last year sailing from Eastern Canada to Greenland, and she'll be talking about aspects of global warming that she saw on that trip. And the title of her talk is Sailing from Canada to Greenland, Arctic Warming in the Northwest Passage. And Janice will be speaking on November 21st by Zoom. Okay, our speaker today is Joseph Tychonievich. He's the author of several books, of which you've seen one today, published by Timber Press, called Rock Gardening, Reimagining a Classic Style. He's currently the editor of our NARG's national publication called the Rock Garden Quarterly. Joseph is a regular contributor to Fine Gardening and Horticulture magazine. He has a new book coming out at the beginning of the year called The Comic Book Guide to Growing Food, Step-by-Step Vegetable Gardening for Everyone. Joseph has gardened in 11 locations, and in these travels, he has met many plants as well as many odd and eccentric people, some of whom are on the chat today, I believe, our Zoom meeting today. He has gardened in Ohio, where he attended university, in Michigan and Japan, where he worked at nurseries, and also he met people and new plants in the United Kingdom, where he did research for his book. He now lives in Williamsburg, where he's also gardening with too many plants, and he has cats, a dog, a husband, and other things, I guess. Anyway, the title of his talk is Confessions of a Plant Nerd. Please welcome Joseph Tychonievich.
Okay, well, it's really great to be here and get to see all of you, at least virtually. So as Bobby said, this talk is going to be, it's called Confessions of a Plant Nerd, and let's see if I can get my presentation going here. Oops, hold on. I better share my screen first. All right. Yes. And now you're seeing my screen, so we can start our slideshow. Okay. Is this looking right to you guys?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So today I'm going to talk, this talk is called Confessions of a Plant Nerd. And like Bobby said, say what?
Joseph, Cindy said it's looking good, but we're not quite good. We're actually in the presentation view for the presentation.
Oh, I see what has
All right.
And then your deck.
Yeah, let me see. I think I know what to do.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, thank you for letting me know. I can't tell what it looks like from your side. So does that look right now?
That looks perfect.
That's perfect. Awesome. Okay. So as Bobby said, I've had a chance to do a lot of fun things with gardening. It's taken me a lot of fun places and met a lot of cool plants and a lot of quirky people. So today I'm going to tell hopefully some fun stories about gardening, hopefully learn a little bit about plants and maybe make you laugh about some of the interesting people that I've met along the gardening way. I've been gardening for a long time, since I was a kid, but I really got into rock gardening when I lived in Michigan and started working at Arrowhead Alpines, which is a nursery some of you may know. So Arrowhead Alpines grows still some, but it grew a lot of alpine rock garden plants up in Michigan. And I worked for the owner, Brigitta. There's a picture of us. There was a magazine article about us, and they wanted a serious photo of us together. And that's how successful we were at taking one. Brigitta is a fantastic plantswoman, unbelievably knowledgeable, grows tons of incredible plants, which we cannot grow now that I live in the South, like these little Alainopsis primroses that are just spectacular. She has a huge collection of Trillium hybrids. A lot of these are hybrids with Trillium sulcatum, which are so impossible to propagate. I doubt they'll ever be for sale, but her garden has this enormous collection of these really spectacular Trilliums. But what's interesting about Brigitta, and I think a lot of people who run small specialty nurseries actually, is that she loves plants a lot more than she loves people. So it was always interesting if anyone came to the nursery, if they mentioned the word petunia, she would not sell them anything because they were not worthy to be buying her alpine plants. So it was always sometimes a struggle working there to get her to actually consent to sell plants to people who she didn't think were worthy plants people. And more than plants, she loves her raccoons, actually. The greenhouses were full of orphaned raccoons. A friend of her runs a wildlife rescue, and sometimes these injured raccoons really couldn't go back into the wild, and they would wind up living somewhere in the greenhouses and often tipping over all the pots on the benches and while exploring for fun things. But I learned so much from Brigitte working there about alpine plants and rock garden plants, and really set me off on the sort of this rock gardening journey that I've been on, as well as more than I ever expected to learn about raccoons, actually. But my real first introduction to gardening before I even got to that was in plant breeding. I've always loved breeding plants, and before I started working for Arrowhead, I actually was in graduate school at Michigan State University doing a terrible, terrible, tedious project with petunias. So this is a picture from my research. Then the tops of these two images are species petunias, Petunia axillaris, the white one, and then the purple and the red are exerta and why am I blind? I'm so glad I don't remember the name of the species of petunia. Anyway, I made lots of hybrids between these petunias and had to characterize them, and quickly learned that though I love plants and plant breeding, academic horticulture was not for me at all. But I really love breeding plants and plant genetics, and something I think, my first book is called Plant Breeding for the Home Gardener, and I think it's something that a lot of gardeners can play with and have a lot of fun with, whether it's petunias, which are kind of a tedious plant sometimes. One of my early explorations while I was in grad school going nuts with petunias was with corn, actually. I had this brilliant idea to breed colorful corn in the colors of the school colors. So MSU's colors were green and white, and I thought, well, if I could get an ear of corn that had green and white kernels together, I could sell it at the farmer's market to people who love football. I kind of know that football is the one with pointy ends on the side of the ball. That's the extent of my sports knowledge, but I know that people love football. So I had this great idea to take a green corn called Oaxaca green and a white corn and breed them together and try to get green and white corn, which did not work because when you hybridize corn, the green color is produced by a blue pigment and a yellow pigment being produced together at the same time. And so when I hybridized it with the white, those things became disassociated, and I got green and white and blue and yellow corn, which doesn't work because Michigan State's arch rival is the University of Michigan, whose colors are blue and yellow. So I created a whole football rivalry all on one ear of corn. It did not pay off the way that I thought. But it was interesting, and this is something I think is like a lesson I've learned with gardening generally, is often things not working the way I think open up a whole new opportunity to find out other things that wind up being more interesting or exciting. So I had this corn that wasn't the colors I wanted, but then on some of the ears, I noticed these really cool kernels that were pale, almost iridescent blues and purples. And I thought, well, that's pretty. So corn is weird because the genetics of the seed determines the color of the individual seed. So if you pick off all the seeds that are one individual color and grow them out, you get ears of corn that are that color. So I picked off these cool little pale blue and purple ones and got these really iridescent, pretty ears of corn, which set me off on a whole little weird moment of corn growing for a while, which was a nice relief from graduate school. All kinds of bright, shiny colors, interesting ones with little pink tips to the ears. I started breeding the darkest colors I could and got this really dark blood red corn, which was really fun. Especially fun because you could take that corn and grind it up into cornmeal and make cornbread that looked like brownies. So that was really fun. So I love plants and gardening, and I love alpine and rock garden plants, but I love all kinds of other plants. And I really am an advocate for exploring and playing with and having fun with all the interesting diversity that plants can bring to your life. I kind of have a love of weeds. So this is a plantain, which, is a very common weed. Actually, not as common down here. Now I'm in Virginia as it was back in Michigan, but it's pretty common lawn weed. And I got a bee in my bonnet about growing and breeding those. So I collected different forms of it that had red leaves and ruffled leaves and bred them together to create this version of plantain that I called purple perversion. And you can actually get seeds from it from Gelito Seed and a couple other places now, because I call it purple perversion because it's purple and twisted. And also you'd have to be a little bit crazy to grow it in your garden because it's an obnoxious weed. It seeds everywhere. But I figure I'm going to have weeds in my lawn anyway because I don't care enough to dig them all out. And why not have them be purple and frilly? Then there's the next level of that, which is the version rosularis, where the seed heads produce these big ruffles of frilly leaves. So that's been a fun project. And I love, that's something that you're going to see if you visit my garden or follow me online or whatever. I really love growing all kinds of different plants, and some of them are weeds or not, but I really believe in embracing all kinds of plants that you may enjoy, whether other people think they're weeds or not. But I also really like those basic principles of plant breeding can really be applied to rock garden plants. So this is a wonderful species of Zinnia, actually, which does not look at all like the regular annual zinnias, which are native to Mexico and warm climates. This is a species that's native to the Western US and is actually hardy to zone 5, and it's a great hardy perennial. This picture I'm showing right now, I took in Denver, of course, where this thing grows like a weed and just makes these carpets, low-growing carpets covered with yellow flowers. It's a really stunning, long blooming perennial. But like a lot of plants that love Colorado, it hates the rain and the humidity. So the first time I tried growing it, there was a cultivar for sale called Blue and Gold that has bluish foliage and with the yellow flowers. And I thought, well, I'm going to take this and put it in my garden. I see it looks so great in Colorado. And it like died immediately. It could not take all the rain. It can't take that heat and humidity that we have down here. But what I decided to give it another try, and I actually ordered seeds. I found seeds from all planes. You can get seeds from these things through the NARG Seed Exchange and many other places. And the great thing about growing from seed is you get genetic diversity. And often when I grow things from seed, especially if I'm kind of pushing the zones, you're going to find some of the individuals die, some of them survive, but those that survive have those genes that are better adapted to our local climate. So sure enough, the name cultivars selected in Colorado, terrible in the East and in rainy climates. But a lot of my seedlings did great for me in Michigan and have moved down to me to Virginia and have done really, really fabulous as well. I would say about half of them just rotted out, but the other half really survived beautifully. And I had some variation. They grow in my rock garden. They need a decent drainage, but not like crazy extreme conditions. And there's some variation. This one kind of has an orange center to the flowers. Another seedling was more all yellow. But that's something that I really loved and learned from my time in grad school and working with plant breeding and genetics, that there's a real great practicality to growing plants from seed. And if you can get seed, if you're trying to grow something that you think won't survive in the South and take our heat and humidity, if you can grow out a bunch of seedlings, you can really have that opportunity to select and find the version of that plant that's gonna thrive down here. I've kind of gone on an aloe craze lately, and I've had the same experience with this aloe. It's now in a new genus, Alainopsis or something, but I'm still calling it an aloe. Still looks like an aloe spathulata. This is one of the hardiest species of aloes. And again, I grew a bunch of them from seed, probably had about 30 plants. And of those 30, about 20 of them died the first winter. And then the others have done fantastic for me. They make a big mass of the succulent foliage here in Williamsburg. Don't mind, the endless rain and the wet summer, winters. It's done really fantastic for me. I have this one growing in my rock garden, actually some just in my regular garden soil, and they've done really, really well. I love the succulent foliage. The flowers are really, really pretty, but I've not gotten very many of them yet, which is why you just have one close up of that flower to make it look pretty. But I something that's like a real gardening principle that I've learned, especially as I'm trying to find rock garden plants that will grow for me in the South, is whenever I can do stuff from seed, it really opens up a lot of opportunities. So working at Arrowhead Alpines, getting into rock garden plants, and then I had the opportunity to write the book that we just talked about, the on rock gardening, which was another really excellent and fantastic experience, with some interesting steps along the way. When I pitched the book to Timber Press, I said I want to do a book on rock gardening, and I want to travel around and see gardens in all kinds of different climates because everywhere is different, and I don't want to just do rock gardening in Denver or rock gardening in Michigan. I want to show how it can be in, from Georgia to the West Coast. And they said, oh, that's great. And you have to go to England, because if you don't go to England, no one in the UK will buy the book. If there's no British gardens, we can't sell any the books over there. So you have to go to England. I'm like, okay, that sounds fun. Will you pay for it? And they said, maybe. And then I bought all my flights and they said, oh no, after all, we can't pay for it. You're gonna have to pay for it out of your own pocket. And I'm like, I just got out of grad school and I work at a specialty nursery and I have no money. So I took a rather very, very impoverished tour of England, renting a car, staying in hostels when I could, and then cold calling all these British rock gardeners that I didn't really know. And that's when I discovered that plant people are some of the most generous people out there, because all these fantastic gardeners who are literally emailed out of the blue saying, I want to come see your garden, were like, come stay in my house. And I was like, thank goodness, because I have no money to pay for hotels. So that was a really a fascinating experience. This is John Grimshaw, who some of you may have met. He's spoken to Nargs things. He's a fantastic guy. Again, I'd emailed him out of the blue and he's like, sure, come stay at my house and I'll take you around to other gardens. Here he's posing at the Arboretum where he works. And this is one of the fantastic plants from his garden. It's a variegated oriental poppy. It comes up with this crazy variegated foliage before giving regular poppy flowers. So I landed in Heathrow in London, rented a car, and then spent a terrified week driving on the wrong side of the road around little tiny English lanes, just wondering when I was going to drive into a truck and die, which is very nerve-wracking. And when I got to John's house, I was like, okay, I'm getting to John's house. I'm going to stay there for a couple of days, and he was going to take me to some gardens. And I was like, this will be wonderful. I won't have to drive. I can just sit on the wrong side of the car and let him deal with the British traffic. And when I pulled up, we were chatting, and he's like, oh, and my car is not working, so we're going to have to take your rental car. It's like, oh, great. So I did have to drive along anyway. And then added interest, he says, and one of the people we're visiting wants a pheasant, so we're going to take a pheasant with us. So I wound up driving pretty much halfway across England in the rental car on the wrong side of the road with a live pheasant in the back of the car, desperately hoping it wasn't making too much of a mess back there so I wouldn't get in trouble when I brought it back to the rental place. So that was definitely a interesting experience. And visiting, this is from John's garden. He grows a lot of alpines and other things too. Really, really beautiful garden. He took me to some fantastic little gardens that were really, really inspiring. This is one that I love. This is this tiny little garden, maybe a quarter of an acre, probably even less, where they built these huge vertical walls out of hypertufa and then tufa, limestone rock, and then planted it all up with these incredible crevices of all these incredible, gorgeous alpine plants, little waterfalls running through it. And of course, it's England, so all the primroses and everything are just thriving in it. But I really love this garden and a lot of the English gardens that I saw because they were tiny, really, really tiny, tiny spaces and just packed to the gills with plants and using alpine plants to really get the maximum impact for this little space. So that was something I really took away from that trip, was not just the alpine plants and rock garden plants can be so beautiful, but there's such a great opportunity for people who have small spaces, whether they have a small yard, even if they're just gardening in an apartment, if they have a balcony, you're downsizing from a big house to a condo or whatever, because you don't want to take care of a big property. Rock gardening is such an opportunity to not sacrifice diversity of plants just because you have a small area. And driving around with pheasants is interesting. That's the other thing I learned. This is another British garden, just that, love this front yard because it's tiny. It's maybe 30 feet up to the front door, everything raised up in troughs. So it's at waist level. It's a very easy to care for garden, a very small space garden. But because it's focusing on those miniature alpine style plants, not sacrificing having a diversity of really, really beautiful and interesting plants. On that trip to researching the book, of course, I had to go out west and spend some time in Colorado and spend some time drooling over the plants that I could not grow. And my goodness, the Lewisias out in Denver are just heartbreaking because they're so beautiful. And this garden was just Lewisias everywhere, just blooming. And if you're not familiar with Lewisias, they're named after Lewis of Lewis and Clark. So a succulent plant native to the Mountain West, succulent rosettes of leaves, and in just these incredible, beautiful flowers. And they hate humidity, they hate summer rain, they hate wet winters. Basically, they hate everything on the eastern half of the country. But I remember walking through this garden and just blown away with these masses of Lewisias. And they're like, oh yes, they self-seed everywhere. We have to rip them out of the paths. They're always weeding into the paths, and we just pull them out. I'm just like, oh my God, I hate this so much. But one thing I realized was when you're visiting these gardens, all you see are the plants that look spectacular that you can't grow. But you don't see, of course, the plants that they wish they could grow that they can't, because there's all these plants that hate Denver too. There's a lot of plants that love humidity and thrive in our climates. So I think it's something I had been struggling to grow Lewisias in Michigan, which you could just kind of do if you were careful. And I left that trip and was like, I'm done. I'm not going to torture Lewisias to death in Michigan anymore. And I'm certainly not going to try to torture them in Virginia now. I'm going to embrace the plants that love my conditions and love growing here, the things that are going to self-seed and bloom like crazy and be happy. And if I need to see Lewisias, it's going to be easier to take pre-pandemic, it was easier to take a flight out to Denver and enjoy Lewisias thriving than watching them limp along in my own garden. So in Michigan, the plant that I embraced were the alpine Daphnes, Daphne neorum. This is another Daphne, Audrey Vochins, which did fantastic there. And I remember going to England and seeing Daphnes that looked terrible and feeling so happy because they love the Midwest. Now, I have grown some of the alpine Daphnes in my rock garden here in Virginia, and they're like surviving, but they're not thriving that much. Some of the, other bigger Daphnes you can grow down here, but the alpines are not really growing so great. And that's something, again, I'm wanting to not try to torture my Daphnes down here. I'm going to enjoy the things that really, really love these conditions. And some of those things are alpine plants, and some of those plants are tropical plants. But it's really fun to embrace the things that love these local conditions rather than spending my time pretending that I can grow, Lewisias and Daphnes. So there's a couple of things that I'm loving in my garden. I may have mentioned that I'm obsessed with aloes right now. So this is Aloe aristata, which has been moved into the genus Aristoloe, but it's a really hardy, wonderful little aloe. Maybe as you can see in this photo, I'm not even growing it in my rock garden, just my regular garden soil, and it's done a wonderful job, been very perennial. Not very showy flowers, but makes this really nice, tight, very alpine-looking collection of foliage. And then caladiums, which are something not alpine at all, and feel not very fancy at all. But I was in Seattle drooling over their Mecanopsis, and someone was, I wish I could grow caladiums. We don't have the heat to grow caladiums. They just don't thrive. And it's sometimes like these things that they love the heat and humidity. They grow fantastically down here. They can't grow those in England. They can't grow those in Seattle. And so with those, sometimes I feel like we dismiss the things that love our local climate as like common and not exciting, even though in a lot of places, these are exciting and interesting plants that they can't grow. Another group of plants I've been really loving here are Nemophilas, or Nemophila, I guess Nemophila. This is a genus of annuals from California, actually. Usually California native plants do not love Virginia, North Carolina climate, but I found they've done fantastic here through the winter. So they make a low-growing, dense carpet, completely covered with flowers in the spring. And I start them now. I've just started them in my garden now. In the fall, they grow through the winter, start blooming February-ish, bloom their heads off into June, look fantastic, really, really exciting plants, which I couldn't grow well in Michigan. I couldn't grow well a lot of other places where I've grown a lot of other plants. And they look really great in a rock garden, even though they are an annual, a true annual. They make a nice, dense, low-growing mound of foliage, and they give you that great early spring color. They're kind of, you grow them like you would a pansy or something, a little more exciting and interesting version of that. So I'm really loving embracing the things that want to grow happily and euphorically in this climate. Another thing that I have learned and traveling around and gardening different locations is to embrace and find out the cool native plants in your area. I grew up in Ohio, and I always thought, there's nothing interesting. There's no interesting native plants in Ohio. I just thought it was all boring. And I remember thinking so much. I was obsessed with carnivorous plants, and North Carolina is like carnivorous plant central with the your all the pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, for crying out loud. So there's a lot of really cool plants that are native there. People travel from, people in Europe are just like obsessed with a lot of these carnivorous plants that are so native right in North Carolina and sometimes exclusively native there. And I thought Ohio was just like the pits. There was nothing exciting there. But everywhere I've been and everywhere I've gone, you find out there actually are really interesting native plants and native plant populations that are so worth exploring. This is a shot of one of the rarest plants in North American native plants that's native to like 2 sites on the coast of Lake Erie in Ohio, Tetraneuris herbaceae. So Tetraneuris is otherwise native to the West. There's a lot of beautiful ones that are native to Colorado, and I've been growing a few here in my rock garden. They kind of do okay. They're a small yellow daisy flower, and they grow on these very specific sites in Ohio on this gravelly, crumbly soil. And again, I thought, oh, there's nothing interesting here. And then I took a trip up one time and walked around and started exploring the population. So it's these little yellow daisies, very low growing, very alpine-like plants that grow on a very, basically masses of granite gravel along the shore or limestone gravel, I should say, along the shore of Lake Erie. And walking around that population just was fascinated by the diversity of these little flowers, all kinds of different shapes of the petals and pale flower forms, and then semi-double and in fact even fully double versions of this little daisy. And it was one of those lessons, again, of not dismissing what you have in your backyard, of going out and enjoying the native wildflowers. Wherever you are, there's a ton of really fascinating native plants that are really going to reward you spending time enjoying them, looking closely at their details. I want to wrap up here the last section here, given it's fall and it's bulb planting season, talking about some of my favorite bulbs for the rock garden and for otherwise in the garden. One of my favorite groups of little bulbs for the rock garden are the reticulata group of irises. Little tiny, super, super early spring blooming, fragrant. They're one of those plants that I really, really love, and I always like to give snowdrop people grief because the reticulata irises bloom so early in the spring, same time as many of the snowdrops. And snowdrops are just about the most boring plant I can possibly imagine. I don't understand the Galantophilia, the people who spend hundreds of dollars on a white flower with green spots that looks just like all the other white flowers with green spots. But for super early spring bulbs, the reticulata irises, I think, are just spectacular. This is a shot from Alan McMurtry's garden. He's in Toronto, Canada, and is breeding a lot of these reticulata irises. So reticulata irises are very cold hardy. They're also a group of bulbs which can bloom with little or no cold period. So they're actually very, very well adapted to the south. I've grown them in pots indoors with no cold period at all, and they come up and bloom just fine. So they do quite well as long as they have a dry summer dormancy, which we'll talk about in a second. But they're really spectacular plants. And I'd seen Alan McMurtry's work. He's been breeding these, and he's been breeding a lot of new colors that are just starting to get to market. And when I lived in Michigan, I really wanted to see his gardens. I've been following his work online, and I was like, I'm going to go over and visit his gardens. So it was like March in Michigan, which is, there's an interlude between depth, a feet of snow and the ground had thawed, and his irises were blooming. And I talked my long-suffering husband to driving over to Toronto to visit his garden and see these irises. The border guard going into Canada was extremely confused about why he clearly did not believe that we were going to go look at a garden in March in Toronto. It didn't make sense, but they let us in the country anyway, very skeptically. And I promised my husband that I knew that this garden was beautiful. There's going to be beautiful flowers. We'd spend like 20 minutes there, and then we could go to Toronto and go to museums and, culture things and have a good time. And then I pulled up to this beautiful garden that I promised, and everything was covered with plastic dish pans because Alan is breeding these, and he doesn't want the bees going and making hybrids between these different ones. He wants to hand pollinate everything. So everything in bloom is covered up, so you can't actually see it. And then Alan is a wonderful guy, very, very talented breeder, loves to talk, and he had very long, elaborate stories about all these things, disputes he's having with bulb growers in the Netherlands, and and then he would unveil one little patch of his irises. Those were stunningly beautiful. All his different hybrids with these beautiful patterns and stuff that he was creating. So he'd talk for 20 minutes, show me a few irises, cover it back up, talk for another 20 minutes. So the brief visit to irises that I promised turned into like 3 hours of crazy rants about irises. But they're really a fantastic group of plants, and you should be, if you like early spring bulbs, they're again, very well adapted. I love growing them in troughs. And there's a lot of new colors and forms and stuff that Alan has been producing that are really spectacular and are slowly starting to get to market. So keep your eyes out for those. I love growing spring bulbs, and I've really been inspired this year by actually we just had an article in the NARGS Quarterly, which I edit, talking about growing plants in troughs. And this photo blew me away. It's just a simple white crocus growing in a trough. And I was like, I have to recreate that. And I'm really this year going all in on growing my little bulbs in containers in troughs for a bunch of different reasons. In a container like this, it's easy to keep the voles and from dirt digging in there and eating all the bulbs. It's a great way to display a small bulb that you have a few of in a really fantastic way, beautifully. And a lot of these spring bulbs will do fantastic as long as you can keep them dry in the summer. So like the reticulata irises and many of these other spring bulbs, they are going to perform wonderfully, but they're going to sit and rot out in our wet summer. So growing in a container like this or a rock garden trough, if it's just that bulb, you can then move it after they go dormant in the summer. Just take that whole container and put it in a shed, in a garage, under the eaves of a house, on the porch. Summer, we can keep the rain off and let them just get bone dry through the summer. And I found it's a really fantastic way to grow a lot of bulbs and have them perennialize and perform really well here, because you can just take them out of the rain and let them pretend that they're living in a Mediterranean climate that's dry in the summer. So I've been just buying crocuses like crazy and potting them up. If you don't know, Odyssey bulbs up in Massachusetts, fantastic. Oh my God, he has this huge list and all these really amazing crocus hybrids and stuff that I've been going nuts with and planting them up in containers. But I just love spring bulbs, and given we're coming into bulb planting season, I talked about growing them in containers, but I also wanted to share what I think are the key steps to maximally successful bulb planting. So there's a few things that really make growing spring blooming bulbs, the best way possible. And this is a very scientific a way to focus your bulb growing efforts. So the first step, I think, for ordering bulbs is to start early. It's too late this year, but next year, I really like ordering my bulbs in the spring when they're in bloom. So when the daffodils and everything are flowering, the crocuses are looking fantastic, that's the best time to look at my garden and evaluate where I need some color, what plants I really, really want. You're going to get the best selection then. Half the stuff is sold out by now, and often you're going to get a discount. So there's a lot of good reasons to order your bulbs early. In the year, start ordering in May or June. I think the most important reason to order early is because it makes it easier to do step 2, which is forget everything that you ordered. Okay, so this is a very important step when you're shopping for bulbs, because then it's more exciting when your order comes. Because I order everything, any receipts or whatever, I put away and just completely forget about it, because then sometime around now, box arrives in the front door and you get to open it, and it's like Christmas or your birthday, except for it's gifts that I picked out for myself, but I've forgotten everything. So it's a surprise. It's all fresh and new. So I always love it when the box arrives, I get to open it and see what did I buy myself that I have no idea what was. So I'm always loving, see my favorite bulbs. I love tulips. They don't perennialize well down here, but Princess Irene is a beautiful one to put a few of in a pot or somewhere to enjoy. My favorite daffodil, Thalia, which is just a spectacular white. I'm always planting more Anemone blanda. I love it when I've bought myself these little windflowers that do well in shady conditions. So once you've forgotten what you've ordered. You get the fun of opening a package of surprise presents you bought yourself. Step 4 is, I think, one harder to pull off, but really, really a great way to maximize your bulbous pleasure in the garden, which is having other people hide your bulbs. So when you're planting, I think the best way to do it is to get a group of friends, and you can have 3 or 4 people. You all have your bulbs, and you take turns going between each other's houses. Whoever lives in that house goes inside and cannot participate at all, and everybody else plants their bulbs. And then go to the next person's house, and whoever lives there stays inside. So everyone's bulbs get planted, but nobody knows where they are, which is really, really, I think, the best way to do it. There's an alternate version of this, which I call bulb bombing, which is sneaking into other people's gardens without their knowledge or permission and planting bulbs in their gardens. Also incredibly fun. I did this a bunch in Michigan. Brigitte, who I showed you that I worked for, I like to sneak it. I snuck into her garden one fall when I knew she was out and planted a bunch of crocuses, some little species, tulips, Tulipa tarda, which perennializes quite well, and it's one of the good species that for grow here down in the South will perennialize down here. The bulb bombing, you need to know somebody pretty well, but Brigitte was a good friend, and every spring she's like, I always wish that I planted crocuses, and I never think to plant them. So that fall I snuck in and planted a few of them. The secret here also is to not do it halfway. If you put like 6 crocuses in somebody's yard, they're going to think, oh, well, the squirrels carried them in or something. But if you do like 100, then it's pretty surreal, and it's a pretty great impact when they come back in the spring and there's like all these flowers kind of popped out of nowhere. If you can't do any of that, or you bought a last minute purpose, the other thing when I plant bulbs is I never put labels where I stuck them. I keep a list of what I planted so I can refer back to it later, but I put them in the ground and I do my best to forget where I planted them, which is very easy for me to do. Because then in the spring you get this fun, which is going around, you're stalking your garden, trying to figure out where you or somebody else plant bulbs, see what unexpected things are popping up. And then, of course, the final step to this bulb planting is to replete annually, unless you hate happiness. I like to talk about that. It's kind of silly, a way to talk about planting bulbs and other plants in the garden. But I think it really does come back to something, I'm talking about like all the things, gardening done, people I've met in the gardening world, is that I really come back to thinking that gardening is about the joy, the pleasure of it. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about gardening, I hear these people talk sometimes about like, well, you should plant foliage instead of flowers because foliage lasts longer. And that's true, but I think at the core of it, gardening is about the joy and the pleasure and the beauty that you create from it. And I really like to emphasize taking that time to really enjoy the process of planting and growing plants that you love. And maybe it's not going to look perfect, and maybe it's not going to look like something in the magazine, or maybe they're not plants that somebody else would have chosen, but that's not the point. The point is to grow things that you really love and are going to enjoy and thrive in your garden. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I'll wrap up with some blatant self-promotion. So Rock Garden, 2 of my books, Rock Gardening, which has been out for a while now, and then coming in February, this very strange little book, which is about vegetable gardening for total beginners, written in the form of a comic book, which should be fun. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you. Hold on. Oh, what did I just do? And I'd love to, if there's questions or whatever, let me see. I'd love to answer questions or comments if anybody has them.
Thank you so much, Joseph. The power of forgetfulness, that's my takeaway. I wish I was your neighbor. You could bulb bomb me and I'd plant things in your yard. It would be so much fun. I love that way of thinking about gardening, because so much of it is play and going back to childhood almost. So thank you for that. So I saw a question, but I lost it. It was when is the comic book coming out?
It's coming out February 2nd.
Okay. And is that going to be distributed like Amazon and?
It'll be Amazon. It'll be everywhere. And it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever fine books are sold. And if you have any contact with me, you're going to be hearing about it incessantly. So that
Okay.
around January, well, I'm going to talk about it nonstop, so you will not have the opportunity to forget.
Yeah. So Joseph, what's your handle on Instagram? Because I know you post some nice stuff over there.
Oh, it's at Tychonievich. So my last name. Let's see if I can put it in the chat. Yeah. So if you have my last name, just search for my last name on Instagram.
Okay.
It'll pop up on Instagram. And then I'm on Facebook too. Yeah. And I put, whatever plants are on there, on that.
I have from Catherine Phelps. What are some plants that will multiply in the South, especially bulbs?
Plants that will multiply. So I've been on a fall crocus kick. So the colchicums are the autumn crocuses that are not crocuses, but the true fall blooming crocuses. And I just was at Colonial Williamsburg here in town, has this huge mass of Crocus coccianus that has seeded out to like hundreds of them, making this huge mass. So that's one that I think of most fall crocuses, like saffron crocuses, hate wet summers and just rot out. But there are some of these fall crocuses that multiply really well down here. And I love having those right now because I feel like in the fall, everything's orange and red, and it's fun to have purple crocuses in the fall. It's like a nice, weird jolt of spring in October. So that's something just on top of my head because I just saw it a few days ago.
Yeah.
And Crocus speciosus is also blooming right now and has perennialized well for me, as long as you can keep the voles off. The voles that is like moving from Michigan to Virginia. The voles are the worst thing about gardening down here. They're so obnoxious, but I plant everything with permatil around it. And it's not, I would say it's not perfectly effective, but it does pretty well. And my crocuses and cyclamens and stuff kept them from eating that. And my hostas actually, so that's worked 90% of the time.
On a related question, I got a private question that I couldn't answer related to your presentation. Someone wanted to know the name of the nursery you recommended for bulbs.
Oh, Odyssey Bulbs. So he's in Massachusetts, and it's just like a really fantastic list. And I'm growing his has all these weird crocuses, and that's where I got a lot of my fall blooming crocuses. They're more expensive because they're weird things, but again, I'm loving growing in containers because you can put 3 crocuses in a little pot and it looks pretty. And then once they multiply, maybe I can add them out to the bigger rock garden and show them off there. So Odyssey, like Homer's Odyssey.
I put it in the chat for everyone.
Oh yeah.
Joseph, is your book with the comics book directed to young children as well?
It's not written aimed at young children. It's aimed at sort of adults. It's a graphic novel. But so it's not aimed at children, but it's aimed at mostly people who don't know which end up to plant a plant. So sort of very basic vegetable gardening for beginners. But it's aimed at adults. I mean, I think kids would enjoy it too, but it's aimed at adults.
Are they your drawings, Joseph?
Say what?
Are they your drawings in the comic?
No, thank goodness they're not my drawings, because if you've seen my drawings, they're terrible. No, so I'm working with a really fantastic illustrator, Liz Kosick. She's has an art background and now also is a botany biology graduate student. So she has a really nice mix of knowing the art and also botanical stuff. So she's just phenomenal illustrator. Hopefully be able to show some images from the inside of the book soon, because it's really beautiful. I'm really thrilled with her illustrations.
Can I ask you a seed question about the Nemophilas, Caladium and the penny black? Do you have a good source for that seed?
I don't remember where I've got them because I've had them for so many years. So one place a seed hunt is they do almost all exclusively California native plants, and I think that's where I got one of them.
Seed hunt. Okay.
Seed hunt, and that's a fun rabbit hole, and that's an interesting. I found a lot of California native annuals actually do really well as winter annuals here, because It's a dry the summer dry climate, rainy winters. Our summers they can't survive, but these California annuals actually, I'm getting a bunch more. I've had some that done terrible, but some of them that actually do really well planted in our fall, because fall through spring we're kind of, you can pretend it's a Mediterranean climate, and they're an annual, so when the summer keeps raining, they just die and are not fine. So yeah, I've gone down they just put up their seed list for seed. That's a fun place to explore. Penny black is like pretty widely available.
That's the one I've heard of before.
Yeah. Maculata, which has the white, sometimes called 5-spot. That was the best performer. The biggest flowers, just
really okay.
Yeah, I was really, really thrilled with that. And then, of course, I'm trying to make hybrids between all of them because I always do that. So we'll see.
Of course you are.
Joseph, besides plantain, have you tried breeding any other weeds?
I went on a whole dandelion kick, actually, for a while. But there's a bunch of cool species. I grew pink and white dandelions that I really loved, that were total weeds for me and seeded around. They're actually they tend to self-pollinate, and they're very hard to hybridize. So I didn't actually get any hybrids, but I had a whole collection of dandelions, most of which did not do well actually in my Virginia garden. Some dandelions are actually quite fussy, as it turns out. But yeah, I had a whole dandelion moment. I had this vision of like a lawn with weeds in it, but all the dandelions were pink instead of yellow. I thought that would be fun.
Are the red plantains hybridizing with the green one?
Yeah, they do. They're the same species. It's just a different variant of it. So they will interbreed with the regular green ones. The purple trait is dominant, actually. So most of the seedlings come out purple. The other weed I grow is pokeweed. I think you may know I can't think of the yellow leaf cultivar's name. But it's bright yellow green foliage on that big, huge pokeweed plant, which I really love. And it seeds around everywhere. And about half the seedlings come up true to that yellowy foliage, so that's fun to have too.
Do you know whether they serve as hosts for the caterpillars, the red plantain?
Yeah, I see the same caterpillars. So it's the same as the wild plantain, just with extra of the pigment anthocyanins. So yeah, I saw all the same caterpillar hosts on them. Presumably, it's used as like herbal remedies. Presumably, it would be the same for all those other things, but just
the seeds are available up from you.
So Gelito seeds is the one place. That's who I sent seeds to them, and they've had it for a while, and I think it's still on their listing. And then that's another great rabbit hole for seeds. Gelito, they're based in Germany, but they have a huge list of cool perennials and all kinds of fun things to put down that rabbit hole.
Could you please put their name in the chat too?
Hold on.
Thank you.
I can do that. It's Jelitto, Joseph.
Yes, Gelito. There we go. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph.